And finally, Zoe Strimpel has written for Spectator Life this week about the rise of the Thomas Hardy man. Men who have lovely things to say to and about women, but in practice are often the worst when it comes to romantic relationships. She joins me now. Zoe, thanks for joining Spectator TV. You write for Spectator Life this week about the rise of the Thomas Hardy guy. Tell us why you've named men after Thomas Hardy, and what are they like?
Well, they certainly have nothing to do with his writing abilities, his literary skill and imagination, depth, humanity, and the rest of it, which kind of has made him one of my all-time favorite writers and actually poets. And I don't even like poetry, but his poetry is incredible, and it's also incredible about his late wife. I mean, obviously they're both dead now, but at the time, he wrote these poems about his wife Emma, and they're amazing. And I think what the piece is really about, how on one hand you could have this man who seems so almost feminist, really, just the kind of streets ahead of his kind of bros in the 1890s or whatever, in terms of how seriously he takes women, how empathetic he is to women on the page. But then I think the point of the piece is to sort of think about, well, that contrasted pretty severely with his daily life and approach to the women in his actual life, which involved treating his wife Emma pretty badly, driving her mad, possibly always going for younger women, even in his 80s, kind of still the women in their 20s, 30s. And the point is that today there is a similarity in terms of men who are like kind of scholars of women in the same way. I mean, less intelligently, as I say, but they seem to be kind of, like there's this thing, horse whisperers. They're like woman whisperers. Like they understand what women want to hear. They understand how women want to spend their time. They're charming. They seduce you. But these are the ones that often actually end up kind of breaking your heart, treating you very callously in the end, and leaving you completely confused. And I think the sort of slightly wild parallel is this kind of, women, be wary of that potential split between the man who appears to be really like an ally or whatever the word was after Me Too, and how he's actually going to treat you. He may very well end up being the heartbreaker that Thomas Hardy was.
Let's pick up on that word ally, because in the piece you write about the wary connection that you're making between the men who call themselves feminists and allies and the men who will break your heart. What's going on here? Is it a savior kind of complex? Is this the idea of them actually being desperately wanted by the women that they're claiming to help?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting psychological explanation that at least applies to some of them, like the Casanova type that I mentioned in the piece, which I had some experience of when I was quite a bit younger. And I think for them, it's almost like it's a game. And I think it often does originate in a kind of youth or an adolescence where they felt they were, not physically impotent, but impotent in terms of, their ability to get girlfriends or sex or female interest. So they kind of work out how to snare women. I don't think Thomas Hardy is actually in that same, I think that's not what's going on for him. I think what's going on for him is just a genuinely interesting split and contradiction that he himself was confused by, as per that quote that I put in the piece, which is, I don't know how, I don't know why I write like that. I don't know why I'm so good at being kind to women on the page and so difficult with them off the page. So yeah, I think it might be a bit different in today's setting, possibly. Who knows? I don't actually know the actual inner workings of Thomas Hardy's mind.
And we don't expect you to, Zoe. We don't expect you to. We still like your thesis. I suppose we should say at this point, probably not all men. There are plenty of men out there who will be genuine allies of women. But I suppose I think some of those people, if they really do support women and they respect women, they tend to be a bit quieter about it, right? They show it through their actions rather than their words. Perhaps the ones to look out for are the ones who really want to push this idea on you and vocalize all the time just how much they are an ally of women. It's become another tool in their dating box, the feminist kit. I suppose, to dating. And perhaps that's the problem. People who talk about this stuff and who sing the praises of women, but then in their actions don't show it.
I mean, I actually see that across the board in all sorts of areas. I mean, I frankly see that with both genders, especially where, for instance, disdain for capitalism is expressed constantly. You know, the evils of neoliberalism, the evils of money grubbing and trying to be wealthy. And of course, it ends up being hypocritical. So I don't know. I do think the kind of people who feel that they are progressive often engage in a lot of, it's virtue signaling, and it's not always correlated with a genuine sort of intuitive feel for what they say they believe. And you know, as you say, some of the men who I know who are the most, you know, who think it's the most self-evident that women deserve the full respect of human beings of any kind. You know, they wouldn't even think to make a politics out of that. You know, that just is sort of obvious to them. So I think that's in a way you could take that as a warning sign. I suppose it's actually interesting to consider that I don't think Hardy was particularly in a politics of feminism when he was writing this stuff. You know, I think there was a politics of feminism, but I don't think it had people like him in it at that point, you know, the suffrage movement and what have you. Whereas now things are politicized in a slightly different way.
Well, it sounds like Hardy saw opportunity, and he was playing probably on the kindness of a lot of these women as a shot at his opportunity. I suppose we would describe in modern lingo what he was doing as love bombing to some extent, and then obviously not delivering on all of his wordy promises. But, you know, this is a pretty classic example of just being a hypocrite, isn't it?
Yes, and I wouldn't even say he love bombed. I think it's just the old story where, like, you prefer to trade your wife in for your typist, or you know, the typist gets traded in for someone even younger, and it's such an old trope, rather than necessarily being wordy. I think it was just a sort of issue with compulsion and kind of entitlement, maybe. And probably, you know, gaslighting, to use another contemporary term. You know, my impression is that his, you know, wife Emma, it literally was driven mad by being assumed to be mad. So, you know, she was having these very strong reactions to his sort of so-called friendship with the woman that he was actually in love with. So she was kind of right to be feeling like something is not right here, but he was kind of, I think, making her feel like she wasn't right to feel like that. So I think that's when we get into kind of murkier, more subtle terrain of how women are, you know, slightly kind of manipulated by these very clever men. Actually, I had a reader get in touch about that piece and say that he thought maybe I was missing the point, which was that these kinds of men are just narcissists, you know, and obviously love bombing is a classic trait of narcissism. Narcissism's really interesting because everyone's obsessed with it now. It's become like the way to kind of pathologize a certain kind of man. And you know, it's interesting that that's the way this person wanted to see it. I mean, has there been a sudden kind of growth in narcissists among men? I don't know. Possibly.
I don't know either. Maybe we're just getting slightly better at calling it out. But as you say,
I mean, that's Kate. Just to say that's key. I think that's a really important point, actually. You know, putting the women back into this. Poor old, you know, Emma Hardy definitely wouldn't have had the vocabulary that we have now to sort of quote unquote call out Tom or anyone else, and we really do. So we have a much more kind of granular grasp of the foul play that goes on in this space.
Yep, and on behalf of the women who came before us, we have to call them out now. As you say, it's a tale as old as time, but a very disappointing one at that. Zoe, thank you very much for joining Spectator TV.